Okay, our last session of the symposium today is a program about Agnes Whiting. Agnes Whiting is the woman whom this convention is dedicated to, and the name of the convention, Rhythm of the Prairie, is a play on words on her 1950 Dykes Medal winning introduction, Blue Rhythm, which is probably Iowa's most notable iris, or notable contribution to irises. And Agnes Whiting, as a hybridizer, was probably Iowa's most famous hybridizer. So it's notable that this convention is the first convention that's been held in Region 21 since the Omaha Convention in 1990. And it is the first convention that has been held in Iowa since 1950, when Agnes Whiting and her husband Charles were hosts of it in Mapleton near Sioux City. And so we thought it would be appropriate to sort of pay homage to that history and learn a little bit more about the woman and her irises. And it just so happens that Cathy Egerer, the president of the Historic Iris Preservation Society, is an Agnes Whiting aficionado and has put together a wonderful program that I'm so excited about to learn more about our Iowa hybridizer, Agnes Whiting. With that, Cathy Egerer.
Okay. Thank you. I'm a Whiting enthusiast. I have a pretty large collection of the introductions that are still around. And 2 years ago, Gary White put me in touch with Kelly Norris. Kelly was looking for some Whiting irises to plant in advance of the convention to kind of honor Agnes. So I sent him some rhizomes, and they ended up at the Des Moines Botanical Garden. And then several months ago, Kelly contacted me and said, you know, we'd like to do something program-wise about Agnes, and would you be willing to do something about that? I said, sure, it sounds like fun, I'd like that. So I started some research, and I found out that there wasn't a whole lot out there about Agnes Whiting. She was apparently quite a private person, and she detested having her photo taken. So, yes, I was lucky. I'll tell you about that in just a second. I contacted the director of the small historical museum in Mapleton, Iowa, Keith Robinson, said, I'm doing this presentation, is there anything you might have? And he dug through his files and sent me a few photos. He also offered to send Agnes's Dykes Medal to the convention. So it is out in the lobby, right outside the door, little display. Please take a look at it. That is her Dykes Medal for Blue Rhythm. And I looked through the clippings that he sent and the pictures, and was getting more of a feel for her work in irises, but not much about her life. And I really wanted to focus as much on that as on her irises. So my next step was to contact Dave Silverberg, the AIS librarian. I said, Dave, do you have any catalogs from Maple Valley Gardens? Because often they would put some information inside the catalog. I wasn't expecting much, they're hard to find. And Dave wrote back the next day and said, I have about 15 of them, I'll put them in the mail to you tomorrow. Great. Well, the catalogs came, and started looking through them. Still not much about Agnes's life. And it was at that point, I truly feel Agnes decided she wanted her story to be told. Because my next communication, the very next day with Dave Silverberg, he said, I was looking through the files and I found an 8-page handwritten autobiography of Agnes Whiting in her own hand. Wow. That was like the 4th of July coming early. And he sent a copy to me, and it was wonderful. And it truly told her story in her own words up until about 1940, when she introduced her first irises. So we'll share that with you. And then I thought, well, Agnes is kind of looking over the convention. When I got here Tuesday, Kelly pulled me aside and said, I went to the gardens today, Blue Rhythm opened today. So, without any further ado, let me introduce you to Agnes Whiting and the journey to Blue Rhythm. And at some point I might sit down. Some of you know I had a hip replacement last month. I've severely overestimated my ability to stand. So rather than fall down, if you see me disappear behind here, I can still see the screen. The Horticulturist daughter. And I'm going to supplement what's on the screen with some other additional information for you. Agnes Winifred Hester, or as some records say, Winifred Agnes Hester, was born in Van Meter, Iowa on August 19, 1894, the youngest of 12 children. And these are her parents, William and Sabra Hester. Interestingly enough, for 12 kids, 11 of them lived very long and healthy adult lives. Only one died at a young age. William Hester was a horticulturist for the Iowa Seed Company. And that was located in Des Moines, and they specialized in all kinds of things: ornamentals, flowers, fruits, vegetables, farm crops. But he had a particular interest in hybridizing gladioli, which kind of made me grin because that's the same thing my grandmother did, and which is why I have somewhat of a little bit of a green thumb today. Agnes is somewhere in this picture. This was a 1902 photo of the Van Meter School, and she would have been about 8 years old at the time. In 1906, the Hester family moved to Des Moines, and William Hester soon became a partner in the Iowa Seed Company and took charge of all of their experimental work. So Agnes, right from the get-go, grew up in a family where hybridizing plants was the norm, not the exception. And the Iowa Seed Company was well known for its beautiful catalog cover art. I put some examples up here for you to see, but these are gorgeous. Luckily, they've been preserved, and you can see them in online archives. Here's something fun. 1906 catalog is a jigsaw puzzle, and you can buy it on Amazon. Guess who bought one? My granddaughter and I are going to have fun putting that together in July. William Hester was credited for hybridizing a number of vegetable and flower strains. His new Hester squash, which I highlighted in yellow at the bottom, was very popular in the first part of the century. And he also did a number of zinnias and asters and continued his work with gladioli as well. Agnes graduated from West High School in Des Moines in 1912. This is another example of Agnes wanting me to tell her story. I had no pictures of her as a child. And then what are the odds of finding that a 1912 West High School yearbook would have been scanned and placed on the internet with her photo in it? A bonny lass, I will confess, and pleasant to the eye. And there's Agnes in the middle. After she graduated, she attended Highland Park College in Des Moines, where she studied to be a teacher, and she graduated in 1914 and took her teaching exams that spring. Did very well, too. Her marks were high, and she scored 100% in algebra. So with a mathematical mind, it may have helped her down the line with her hybridizing. Moving to Mapleton. In September of 1914, Agnes began teaching 6th grade at the Mapleton School, which is about 150 miles northwest of here. This is the original school building, and that's the building she would have taught in, the white building right there. And it was in Mapleton that she met Charles Whiting. Charles came from a very old family in the area. His father and uncle had founded the Mapleton Trust and Savings Bank, and Charles started out there as a clerk. He graduated with a law degree from Iowa State University, and then went back home, worked in the bank, eventually became the bank's president. And Agnes and Hester and Charles Whiting were married in 1917. And this photo of Agnes on board the steamer America on Lake Superior might have been taken on their honeymoon. Now, here's another coincidence. I live on Lake Superior. Literally, it's outside my back door. And Agnes and the steamer America may very well have sailed right past my town, where I now have her iris beds. Yeah, that just made me grin. The America came to a bad end. It's sitting in the bottom of the lake out by Idle Run right now. Charles served in the U.S. Army, and then when he came home, they built this house on Courtright Street in Mapleton. The house is still there, and I'll have some photos I can show you later. My friend Nancy McDonald, our roots editor, she and I played hooky on Thursday and went to Mapleton. And we found the house, and we talked to Keith Robinson. We got a tour of the town, and we looked around the backyard, and I can tell you about some things that are still there. And Agnes wrote, "We did not get to begin our gardening until the spring of 1919, possibly because the spring of 1919 she was pregnant with her first child. She was with James Whiting, who was born in September of that year, and then their daughter Flora in 1924. But they planted about 30 irises in a perennial border, including these irises that were sent to her by her father, some very old varieties that we still grow today. Then a fateful meeting. By 1925, they had nearly 100 varieties of iris, but that year, Charles was asked to judge a small iris show at the Des Moines Founders Garden Club. This was not an official AIS club, so the judges did not have to be official AIS judges, just somebody that knew something about irises. So Charles was invited to come and judge, and Hans P. and Jacob Sass were there with a display of their irises. This is Agnes's quote: "They stole the show and changed our lives." After that, we never missed a year in their gardens. They went over to the Sass Gardens every year, bought all their named varieties, many of their seedlings, as well as irises from other breeders like F.X. Schreiner, Carl Milliken, Carl Salbach. And these were some of the irises that they had in their gardens from the Sasses. Midwest King Tut, Joycette, beautiful historics that we still have, luckily. Agnes describes how she got into hybridizing. We'd begun some pollinating in 1930, they got the bug. Charles urged me to do nearly all that he claimed his fingers were too clumsy, but Agnes suspected that Charles was really giving her a way to get heavily involved in this. And her interest was spurred. I love the last part of this. The seedlings we saw at the annual meetings, some were so good and some so very bad, it was a challenge. And then she described, in her own words, what she did to try to become the best hybridizer she could. I studied avidly during the winter months. I kept meticulous records. I corresponded with many of the leading hybridizers. I learned all I could from every possible source. That's a teacher at heart right there. Okay, Maple Valley Gardens. By 1933, Charles and Agnes had opened Maple Valley Gardens, selling irises out of their backyard on Courtright Street. And notice the name at the top here, Robert Schreiner. This catalog is from 1933 and 1934. They published one catalog to cover both years. And this was one that she sent to him, and through the years it ended up in the AIS archives. At first, they offered Sass irises. They didn't have any of their own, so they had many, many Sass irises as well as some others that were popular at the time. Here's a couple that were on the first page of that catalog. Oh, yeah, beautiful. And then I came to a quote. She wrote a note in the back of this catalog, and I really had to pull this out because you could plunk Agnes down in this room and she would feel right at home among any one of us. I grew so much iris before I began to sell any that I have quite a bit more than I can dispose of. And she kept going on the back. The prices were pretty high last year, as I didn't care much whether I sold it or not. And finally, I'd just as soon trade with you. This was to Robert Schreiner. Most of my iris money goes into new ones anyway. And if that isn't any one of us, I don't know what is. Then she described the very first important seedling they got from the Sass brothers. In 1935, Mr. Hans Sass divided a new seedling with us, which we used more than any other single iris, to the extent that it became the backbone of our breeding efforts. This was later named Matula, I think that's how it's pronounced. Crossed with Happy Days, it gave us our first named iris, which was Golden Spike. So in 1940, with some help from the Sass brothers, there were some seedlings that they deemed worthy of introduction: Golden Spike, Nylon, and Regine. I always wondered where the name Nylon came from. I joked with Nancy that it's kind of like naming an iris bleach or something. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Maybe nylon had been recently invented, or maybe it was an homage. No. Agnes named this because the day before she got a package of nylons in the mail. And the color was vaguely the same as nylon, so she thought, well, that'll do. And that's what she named it. And then some more irises followed. So the 1940s were some pretty busy times in the Whiting Garden. And these introductions here, Cedar Rose, Copper Frills, Rubiant, and Three Oaks, are all still with us. Okay, through the war years they continued their work, although they had to switch to be lightweight paper catalogs. Printing color was not an option during those times. And they kept going with Garden Glory, Vatican Purple, Tea Rose. Garden Glory disappeared off of our known list last year, and I'm desperately hoping somebody in the AIS still has it and can contact us and let us know, because that was a gorgeous iris and we'd really love to find it again. Here's a fun one, Flight Leader. It wasn't introduced until 1952, but it was named for their son Jim. He was a squadron leader in the US Army Air Force during World War II. And the next part of the story is one of those things you just can't make up. Jim flew P-40 Curtiss Warhawk fighter planes. He was a bomber escort, and his squadron was part of the bombing of Anzio, Italy in 1944. I almost cried when I read that because my Uncle Don died at Anzio and I never got to know him. So when I saw that that was part of the story, it just kind of put a lump in my throat. Anyway, crossing paths was Italian Countess Mary Seni, who had been born in Philadelphia but married an Italian. And she was a great admirer of the Whitings and bought many of their irises in the early 1940s and had them sent to Italy, which she planted in her gardens at Villa Seni outside of Rome. And she later became quite an important hybridizer in Europe and introduced over 100 irises there. This is a picture of Villa Seni, the only one I could find, but you can see all the irises in it and the fountain. Beautiful. Well, stationed right there outside of Rome were two huge German railroad guns that the Germans were hiding in tunnels all over the area where the Villa Seni estate was. These were very dangerous pieces of artillery, caused tremendous damage to the Allies. One of these railroad guns could shoot a shell 31 miles. And some of you that are historians are nodding here. There were two of them, and it was a cat and mouse game to try to find them and destroy them. So Jim's squadron took part in the bombing attempts to try to destroy the guns in 1944. And he destroyed the Seni Gardens where his mother's irises were. Just the kind of coincidence that you say, The villa was rebuilt after the war. It's now a hotel. This is a modern picture. They use it a lot for weddings and things like that. Mary Seni went on to found a famous rose garden outside the city of Rome, and she's very well known for that. After the war, she contacted Agnes and said, I need more irises. They've all been lost. Yeah. Okay, Blue Rhythm arrives. The Whitings introduced 6 to 8 irises a year and expanded their garden into a field across from the local high school. Rocket and Harvest Moon came along in 1945, as well as Cloth of Gold and then Lavender and Gold Lace the next year. Harvest Moon is another one that's recently disappeared, but I think it's still out there. Got a few leads. Here's the second garden across from the high school. Every Whiting garden had at least one Martin birdhouse. You can see it in the background. Built by Charles. He liked to build them. That's their little dog. But this garden was real popular with visitors. And 1945 brought the introduction of Blue Rhythm. Smooth, cornflower blue, tall-bearded, a cross between Annabelle and Blue Zenith, which were two of their other introductions, and were widely used in some of their other blue irises. But Rocket was the one that the Whitings were most excited about. They said it's a brilliant new orange-yellow iris that many of our visitors think is the finest they've ever seen in our gardens. Judges and casual visitors alike went straight to it. They sold it that year for the breathtaking price of $40. I remember my dad telling me after World War II when he went to work for the Michigan Central Railroad, he made $40 a week. And Nancy ran it through the computer last night. What did it, $540 in today's money. Yeah. It's a beautiful iris. But it was the cool, elegant Blue Rhythm that kept attracting all the attention. People just couldn't stay away from it. They were drawn to it over and over. And both Rocket and Blue Rhythm received honorable mentions and awards of merit.
So they sold enough to get back there?
Yeah. The first year Agnes Whiting sold irises, she made a note that it was quite a success. She sold 16 of them. I don't remember which one that was, but she thought Blue Rhythm was a good step toward getting near a real true blue iris, and they priced it at $25, which would be about $300 in today's money. In 1947, Agnes Whiting was awarded the AIS Hybridizers Medal, the first woman since Grace Sturdivant to receive it. That award is on the table outside. You can see it. It's in a frame. And they said, Agnes, what are your favorite ones that you've introduced? And she said, I don't have one. It might be Garden Glory or Rocket or Blue Rhythm, but I like them all or I wouldn't have introduced them. Okay, this part I love, and I put this in here 3 reasons. One is because it tells an important part of the Blue Rhythm story. 2, because it's kind of unintentionally hilarious. And 3, it's a shout out and a thank you to this year's convention organizers. Because I hope after seeing this, the headaches that you've had along the way might seem a little smaller in comparison. The 1950 AIS Annual Meeting Convention was held in Sioux City, and the Whitings were to be one of the show gardens. Harry Randall, who was president of the British Iris Society, was scheduled to be the keynote speaker. And here he is in his own garden. But Mother Nature had a few other plans. The next part is a quote from the report on the 1950 convention that was published in the AIS Bulletin that fall. Winter came, but at the wrong time. It would not end at the right time. Spring confused some flowers into bursting into bloom not once, but several times. There was summer in January, then winter in April. New England is parched brown from drought in the season when it should be wet. Tennessee is lush and green in the season when it should be dry as a bone. The weather was completely topsy-turvy. They literally had irises blooming in January and then trying to rebloom in March and then buried under snow in April. So before the convention was to take place, spring was late, nothing was doing well. In the middle of April, they decided to postpone the entire convention by 2 weeks. And if that isn't enough to make your hair turn gray, Gary and Kelly, I don't know what would be. They had 300 people already signed up. I can't even imagine just, okay, well, push it off 2 weeks, nothing's ready. So they had to do a little bit of improvising. Okay, the Howdy Dinner had no entertainment, so the attendees chipped in. First up, barbershop quartet. Geddes Douglas, Franklin Cook, Reverend Folkers, they all chipped in. Next up, boogie woogie piano lesson. Geddes Douglas gave everybody a piano recital. Finally, Dave Hall did solos on the harmonica. I love the one he picked, the first one, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. What a better way to make the best of a rough situation. And then Pink Lady. Unfortunately, the Sass Garden was past peak bloom, but the Whiting Garden was all in its full glory. And 2 of the standouts were in Maytime and Technicolor. I think everyone in the room probably has that mental list of 10 or 12 irises that you'll never be without as long as you can get your hands in the dirt. Maytime is one of mine. That iris stops people in their tracks and you can see it from across the garden. Just one of the most beautiful irises I've ever seen. But it was a 100-foot row of blue rhythm in the Whiting's garden that was catching everyone's attention. And when the votes for the President's Cup were tallied, it received 110 of the 180 votes that were cast. Harry Randall was back in England by the time of the awards dinner, but he recorded his speech during his last stop and they listened to it. However, as for the President's Cup, when they went to give it to Agnes, nobody could find it.
We have them.
The article in the Bulletin said, we sure hope that she has it by now. And take a look at the bottom, the registration fee was $20, including the bus, 3 breakfasts, 3 luncheons, the howdy party, the smorgasbord, and the banquet for $20. And blue rhythm was on everyone's mind when it came time to cast the ballots for the Dykes Medal. Received 100 votes. The next runner-up received 46. I think Argus Pheasant was in there that year. And I'm not as familiar with the history of the Dykes Medal as probably most of you are, but it seems at that time it was awarded at the same convention, not the following year. Is that about, yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
The period of eligibility was shorter. There wasn't as many years that a cultivar had to be on the market or receive as many prerequisite awards important from the Dykes.
Okay.
And the early Dykes medals were gold, and then the war came along and they became silver.
There's an interesting story. The one outside is silver, but Agnes then won an award from the British Iris Society. And when they gave it to her, it was in gold. And she asked Harry Randall, where did you get the gold? And this was post-war, and he said, oh, silly girl. Probably came from the Nazis. This is just a list of some of the major awards that Blue Rhythm won. Personally, my favorite is 1951, where it won first place in the AIS Symposium, but then stayed in the top 100 for the next 20 years. To date, it's one of the most honored irises in history, and that's a picture of Agnes standing next to a clump of it. I only wish I could have colorized it, but that wouldn't have been fair. Okay, beyond Blue Rhythm. By the early 1950s, they were raising 9,000 seedlings a year, and maybe numbering 100 of them. And their commercial irises were being farmed out to a grower in Colorado. So their gardens in Mapleton became their hybridizing gardens. And they continued to introduce some new irises. Cadet Blue is a full sister seedling to Blue Rhythm. That's still out there. I know somebody that's going to try to get it for me. Wood Opal, Flora Whiting, one that they named for their daughter, and Burning Brand, a brilliant copper and red that looks like a burning brand. So we have high hopes we can still find some of these. The main seedling garden was still located behind the wedding house in Courtright Street. This is a picture of Charles and Agnes in their garden. And I was lucky enough to be able to get in touch with some of the Whiting grandchildren, and they sent some stories they wanted me to share with you. Craig Whiting says, when I was a boy, I often visited Grandma and Grandpa, and in season I always got a tour of the gardens. What really struck me all these years was not the flowers, but the image of my grandfather in bib overalls with a white shirt and tie, tending the gardens. His sister Sue says when the photographers were visiting, Grandma would often ask me to be a model. And since I was still very young, I thought this was magical, being a princess in a story. And in one of the photos, you'll see a trellis, well, there it is. Often I would be seated there for the photograph, and I loved to sit there and pretend I was a princess. This photo is outside. I'm afraid I had to stitch this one together from two scans, but this is the backyard of the Whiting house. The trellis is to the right. If you walked through that trellis to the right, you would be walking up to the back door of the house. And there's a martin bird house. The structure in the back is a garage. And Jim Whiting said, several times each week on my way home from school, I would cut through my friend Johnny Welch's backyard to get to the garden that you see. Johnny and I were close friends, so I wasn't really trespassing, he says. I'd look up and down the paths in the garden looking for my grandmother. The plants were tall, but I would usually find her on her knees digging and planting. She loved the company, and we would visit for a bit. She always had questions about what we were doing in school, and frequently she would send me on some assignment, like feeding the goldfish in the ponds while she'd finish up her project. They had 2 goldfish ponds in their gardens, and fish got pretty big. In those days, we kids were expected to work and save money. I had the job of mowing Grandma and Grandpa's yard. This was in addition to my own yard, and the Episcopal Church's yard, and a few others. Also, my grandpa would ask me to help him with jobs around the house. One of the tasks that he and I did together was to clean and maintain the birdhouse that you see in the photo here. Grandma and Grandpa loved birds, particularly the martins that ate the mosquitoes and the other bugs in the yard. So the birdhouse you see on the tall pole is a martin house. And Grandpa had a special ladder that he would lean against the tall pole of the birdhouse, and my job was to climb the ladder and clean out last year's nests. Grandpa would set me up with a special brush and a container of powdered sulfur, and I would dust out the birdhouse, and the powder was to destroy any mites, so we worked on it together. And he said that he and Grandpa also started a business building and selling martin birdhouses. They repaired Edison photographs in the basement of the house where Grandpa had a workshop. And Grandma and Grandpa loved trains, so many nights each week, Grandpa and Grandma would pick us up in their car, a Mercury, and we'd go watch the trains roll through town. And one Saturday, Jim and Susan got treated to a trip to Sioux City on a train by Grandma and Grandpa. They had, this one, it just cracks me up every time I read it. They had an entire room dedicated to saving their complete set of National Geographic magazines. My grandmother, the gladiolus grower, had an entire room devoted to saving her complete set of National Geographic magazines. I don't know what it was that people would not throw them away. But Grandma, Agnes, liked to dress up like a ghost on Halloween, and she would drift across the Mapleton City Park going, ooh, and trying to scare the kids. And they also took voyages on tramp steamers down the coast of South America. Charles and Agnes did. I'll show you something of that in a second. The building you see in the back is a garage and a workshop shed. The Mercury was stored on the right side, and the workshop is on the left. Behind the garage, you can see like a white fencing there, were empty boxes and baskets and stuff to go to the dump. And in the workshop, they had the shovels and the spades, and they made their own plant markers, maybe zinc, that were etched with a mild acid solution, and apparently they held up very well. Hanging from the right side of the garage, you can see it is dark, is another Martin birdhouse made from barrel staves that Jim remembers building with his grandpa, also rather enduring. I have another story from a gentleman who is still alive, Mr. Don Roy. He lives in Massachusetts. When Don was a young lad, he grew up in Omaha. His father was in the insurance business and often had to go up to see Charles Whiting in Mapleton. So Don would ride along, and he would get dropped off at the Whiting Gardens while his father did his business with Mr. Whiting. And Agnes was usually found deadheading the irises. So she would talk to him and show him how to deadhead, and he said he was kind of a shy teenager. So this meant a lot to him. And it's inspired a lifelong interest in irises. And Don is now in his 80s and lives in Massachusetts and is a HIPS member. So it was kind of a fun memory that he shared. The Whiting legacy. I mentioned that they like to travel in the winter months. Here they got on a steamer in Halifax, Nova Scotia to sail down to Bermuda, the British West Indies, and San Juan, Puerto Rico for 5 weeks. But in the springtime, they'd be back in the gardens again, and together they introduced more than 130 new irises. Many became outstanding parents. Jane Phillips, crossed with Blue Rhythm, gave us Eleanor's Pride, Dykes Medal winner 1961. Strange one, a miniature dwarf bearded, a blaze crossed with the tall bearded Technicolor, resulted in the standard dwarf bearded flame spot. And then another one that's a personal favorite of mine, Maytime, crossed with, where are you, Extravaganza and a sibling of that. Broadway Star, one of Schreiner's best known irises. Another one I have in my garden. Must be something I've got all these, so I must be drawn to them. Agnes Whiting passed away on July 6, 1966 at the age of 71 after a short illness. Her Dykes Medal is on permanent display here at the Museum of American History in Mapleton. It's the former Trinity Episcopal Church, the same one that her grandson used to mow the lawn for. This church was built by Charles Whiting's father in honor of his mother when she passed away, and it's now a museum. Charles Whiting kept the private garden going for a while, but in 1970 he posted an ad in the paper and said, "I'm giving away all the irises in the big field, come and get what you want. Let's beautify the town of Mapleton." So their irises are scattered all over the town. He also helped to found the Fisher Whiting Memorial Library, and it was dedicated on May 12, 1984, and I took this picture the other day when we were up in Mapleton. Blue Rhythm is blooming in the front of the library. So the library was dedicated in May, and it contains a painting by their daughter depicting some of the Whiting irises, and there's Blue Rhythm right in front. Charles passed away less than 3 months after the library was dedicated at the age of 93. Lost or not? HIPS is trying to locate some of the missing Whiting irises so we can place them in the Guardian Gardens program, grow them, and share them so that they aren't lost forever. These irises were all known to be in gardens within the last decade. Can you help us find some of them? Cynthia Ann Parker, that's a beautiful photo. It's in the wiki online. Beautiful blue iris. We'd love to find it again. Baghdad, beautiful yellow. She did a lot of yellow irises. And Kelly was telling me one about Vicia. Did I pronounce that right? Vicia. We wondered what it meant, and Kelly explained it's an acronym for Iowa State University's colleges, veterinary and
Engineering, industrial science.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are pictures of it around. It's been around recently. Maybe we can find it again. Aurora Dawn, isn't that gorgeous? Well, it's been around recently enough that somebody took a good picture of it. And then some other ones here that we know have been here, but aren't here at the moment. And we'll be posting this on the HIPS website, so if you can share this with your garden club, look around and see if maybe you have some of these. If you live in Iowa, there's a good chance they're floating around somewhere because the whiting sold irises all over the place here. Please help us honor Agnes and Charles by keeping their irises alive. And if you can find any of them, or if you have a lead, contact me. I'll see what I can do to see what I can find them again. And I want to thank a few people that this would not have been possible without. Dave Silverberg. Thank you, Dave, you were invaluable. And Keith from the museum, the writing grandkids, and all the people who have contributed to the AIS Encyclopedia, because I did get some of my photos from there, and I'm sorry I can't credit you all individually, but thank you for what you did. And with that, I thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed your visit with Agnes Whiting.